The Magician's Horse. Once there was a king who had 3 sons. One day, the 3 princes went hunting in a large forest that was far from their father's castle, and the youngest prince lost his way, so his brothers had to return home without him. The lost prince wandered through the forest for 4 days. At night, he slept beneath the stars, and when he was hungry, he ate roots and wild berries. At last, on the morning of the 5th day, he came to a large open space in the middle of the forest, and there he found a magnificent mansion, but not a living soul was to be seen there. The door was open, and the prince entered and walked through the deserted rooms. In the end, he came to a great hall, and in the center of the hall was a table laden with delicious food and wine. The prince sat down and ate and drank until he was full, but the next moment the table vanished. The prince thought this was very strange, but though he continued to search all the rooms, he could find no one to speak to. Finally, just as it was beginning to get dark, he heard the sound of footsteps, and he saw an old man coming towards him up the stairs. "What are you doing in my mansion?" asked the old man. "I was hunting in the forest, and I lost my way. Now I would like to stay with you. If you let me work for you, I will serve you faithfully," replied the prince. "Very well," said the old man. "You may be my servant. You must make sure that the fire in the kitchen stove is always burning, and you must look after the black horse in the stable. I will pay you 1 gold coin a day, and at mealtimes you will always find plenty of food and wine on the table, and you can eat and drink as much as you like." The prince was very happy, and he promised that he would always fill the stove with wood and never let the fire die down. Although he didn't know it, his new master was a magician, while the fire in the stove was a magic fire, and if it ever went out, the magician would lose a great deal of his power. Well, one day the prince simply forgot about the stove, and the fire burned so low that it nearly went out. Just as the last flames were flickering, the old man hurried angrily into the kitchen. "Why have you let the fire burn so low?" he roared. "If I had arrived a minute later, it would have gone out altogether." And while the prince quickly threw a log into the stove, his master boxed him on the ear and warned him that if it ever happened again, there would be trouble. A few days later, the prince was sitting unhappily in the stable when, to his surprise, the black horse spoke to him. "Come closer," it said. "I have something to say to you. Fetch my bridle and saddle from that cupboard and put them on me. Take the bottle that is beside them. It contains some special oil that will make your hair shine like pure gold. Then gather all the wood you can and put it into the stove until the fire is burning more fiercely than ever before." The prince did what the horse had asked him to. First he put the bridle over its head and the saddle on its back. Next he rubbed the oil into his hair until it shone like gold. Finally, he built such a big fire in the stove that the flames leapt up and set fire to the roof, and in a few minutes the whole mansion was burning. The boy hurried back to the stable, and the horse said to him, "There's one more thing you must do. In the cupboard you'll find a mirror, a brush, and a riding whip. Bring them and jump onto my back. We've got to get out of here as fast as we can." The prince did as he was told, and as soon as he had jumped into the saddle, the horse raced away. Very soon they had left the forest and all the land that belonged to the magician far behind them. In the meantime, the magician returned home, but all he saw was smoke and ashes. He shouted for his servant, but his servant was nowhere to be seen. In the end, he went to look for the boy in the stable, and there he discovered that the black horse had disappeared too. Certain that they had left together, the magician jumped onto a brown horse that was also there and set off after them. As the prince rode on, his horse called out to him, "I can hear hooves. Look behind you and see if the old man is following us." When the prince turned, he saw a cloud of smoke in the distance. "We must hurry," said the horse. After they had galloped for some time, the horse spoke again. "Look behind you. How far away is he?" "He's quite close now," replied the prince. "Then throw the mirror to the ground," said the horse. The prince did so, and when the magician rode that way, the brown horse stepped on the mirror. It smashed with a loud noise, and the poor horse stumbled and fell, cutting its hooves so badly that the old man had no choice but to walk slowly back to the stable with it and fit it with some new horseshoes. When they were ready, they set off after the prince a second time. The black horse was very valuable to the magician, and he was determined not to lose it. By now, the prince had ridden a long way, but just then the black horse pricked up its ears again. "Jump down," it said to the prince. "Put your ear to the ground and tell me if you can hear anything." The prince jumped down and listened. "I think I can hear the earth rumbling," he said. "The magician must be getting closer again." "Jump back up," replied the horse. "I'll run as fast as I can." And with that, it began to gallop so quickly that it seemed to be flying over the ground. After a short time, the horse spoke again. "Look back once more. Can you see him?" "I can see a cloud and a flame," answered the prince, "but they're still a long way off." "We must hurry," said the horse. A few minutes later, the horse called out yet another time, "Look back again. He can't be far off now." The prince turned. "He's close behind us," he cried. "The flames from his horse's nostrils will reach us in any minute." "All right," replied the horse, "then throw the brush to the ground." The prince did so, and the next moment the brush turned into a forest. The trees were so close together that when the magician got there, his horse had to suddenly stop. There was no way through, and the old man had no choice but to ride back to the stable for an axe. When he returned, he began to chop a way through the forest, but this took quite some time, and the prince and the black horse made good progress ahead of him. Eventually, however, they once more heard the sound of racing hooves. "Look back," said the horse. "Is he there?" "Yes," answered the prince. "I can hear him clearly." "We must keep going," gasped the horse. And only a little later it said, "Look back now. How close is he?" "Very close indeed," said the prince. "I can see the flames." "Then you must throw down the whip," shouted the horse. In an instant the whip turned into a broad river. When the old man reached it, he rode his horse straight into the water, but the farther the horse went, the higher the waves climbed, and the magic flame, which gave the magician all his power, grew smaller and smaller until, with a fizz, it went out, and both the magician and the brown horse sank beneath the surface and disappeared. When the prince looked round, they were no longer to be seen. "At last," sighed the black horse with relief. "Now you can jump down. The magician is dead, and we have nothing more to fear." When the prince jumped down, he saw a little stream, and just then the horse spoke again. "By the side of that stream, you'll find a willow wand. Strike the ground with it. The earth will open, and you'll see a door at your feet." The prince did what the horse had told him to. Sure enough, a door appeared in the ground, and the boy saw steps leading down into a big hall where the floor, the walls, and the ceiling were all made of stone. "Lead me into the hall," said the horse. "I will stay there, but you must continue over the fields till you reach a garden. In the middle of the garden is a palace. When you get there, You must ask to become one of the king's servants. Goodbye, and don't forget me." Before the prince went on his way, the horse made him promise not to let anyone see his golden hair. The boy promised, and he wrapped his scarf around his head like a turban. Then he walked over the fields until he reached a lovely garden. Just as the horse had said, in the distance he could see the walls and towers of a beautiful palace. He was just about to walk through the gate when the head gardener stopped him and asked what he wanted. "I want to become one of the king's servants," replied the prince. The head gardener stared at the boy's shabby clothes. "You can't enter the palace looking like that. But you may stay and work for me in the garden. I need someone to weed the flower beds and sweep the dead leaves from the paths. You'll get a gold coin a day, food and drink, and a horse to help you carry the leaves away." The prince agreed, and he immediately set to work. But when they brought him his dinner, he only ate half of it. When no one was looking, he took the rest to the stone hall by the stream and gave it to the black horse. He did this every single day, and the horse was extremely grateful for the boy's faithful friendship. One evening, when the boy was in the stone hall, the horse said to him, "Tomorrow many princes and great lords will visit the palace. They are coming from near and far to meet the king's 3 daughters. All the young men will stand in a line in the courtyard, and the 3 princesses will come out carrying diamond apples. Each princess will throw her apple into the air, and the man at whose feet the apple falls will marry that princess. Make sure that you're working close by in the garden. The apple of the youngest princess, who is far prettier than her sisters, will roll past the princes and lords and stop right in front of you. When it does, pick it up at once and put it in your pocket." The next day, when the princes and lords were lined up in the courtyard, everything happened just as the horse had said. The princesses threw their diamond apples into the air, and the apple of the youngest princess rolled past everyone. It rolled right out into the garden, and only stopped when it was at the feet of the young gardener, who was busy sweeping up the leaves. As quick as a flash, the boy bent down, picked the apple up, and slipped it into his pocket. But as he was bending, the scarf around his head slipped a little to one side. Only one person noticed this, the young princess, and when she caught sight of his golden hair, she fell instantly in love with him. The girl was thrilled, but the king was very sad, because of all his daughters, she was the one he loved the most. Still, nothing could be done about it, and the next day a triple wedding was held in the palace. After the celebrations were over, the boy took his bride back to the little hut in the garden where he lived. Time passed, but then one day an army from a neighboring country invaded the kingdom. The king set off to fight them at once, and the husbands of the 2 elder princesses rode at the head of his troops on magnificent horses. The husband of the youngest princess, however, had nothing but the worn-out old cart horse that helped to carry away the dead leaves, and the king, who was ashamed of this son-in-law, refused to give him a better one. As he was determined not to be left behind, the prince went into the garden and jumped on the back of the cart horse. After no more than a few steps, however, the poor old horse stumbled and fell. The boy was angry and frustrated, but then he had an idea. He ran to the stone hall and told the black horse what had happened. "Find my bridle and saddle and put them on me," said the horse. "Then go into the next room. There you will find a suit of armor and a sword. As soon as you're ready, we'll ride into battle together." The prince did as he was told. As he rode out of the hall, his armor glittered in the sun, and he looked so brave and handsome on the back of the beautiful black horse that no one would have recognized him as the shabby boy who worked in the palace garden. They galloped away as fast as the wind, and when they reached the battlefield they saw that the king was losing the fight and that many of his men had been killed. All the same, when the glittering knight on his black horse began swinging his sword, the enemy soldiers were terrified, and they ran like rabbits. When the king and his two elder sons-in-law saw this, they and the few men who had survived shouted out in joy, "A god has come to our rescue!" They all wanted to crowd around the boy, but at that moment the black horse rose into the air and carried him far away. Soon after this, part of the kingdom rebelled against their ruler, and once more the king and his two elder sons-in-law had to ride into battle. The young gardener wanted to join them, and he went to the throne room. "Dear father-in-law, please let me go with you." "I don't want a fool like you to fight for me," grumbled the king, "and anyway, I haven't got a spare horse for you. But I'll tell you what. You see that peasant driving his cart of hay down the road? You can have his horse." So the prince took the peasant's horse, but the poor thing was old and tired, and before it had gone very far, it stumbled and fell. The prince returned sadly to the garden and watched as the king rode away with his other two sons-in-law at the head of the army. As soon as they were out of sight, the prince hurried to the stone hall by the stream. Again he told the black horse what had happened. Then he put on his armor and jumped onto the horse's back. The next second they were flying through the air, and they soon landed right in the middle of the battlefield. Just like before, the boys' swords swung to the left and to the right, and the king's enemies ran for their lives. Once again the king and his men cried out in thanks, "A god has come to our rescue!" But when they tried to speak to the knight in the glittering armor, the black horse rose into the air and carried him far away. When the king and his sons-in-law returned home, the only thing they could talk about was the hero who had won the battle for them, and they all wondered who he could be. Before too long, another neighboring country declared war, and once again the king, his sons-in-law, and their soldiers got ready to ride into battle. Once again the boy begged to go with them, but the king repeated that he had no spare horses. "I'll tell you what, though," he added. "You see that woodcutter coming out of the forest? You can have his horse. It's more than good enough for you." So the prince took the woodcutter's horse, but it was so old and weak that it couldn't even carry him beyond the palace gates. This time when the boy went to the stone hall, the black horse had prepared an even more magnificent suit of armor for him than the old one, and after he had put it on and jumped onto the horse's back, he found himself in the middle of the battle in the blink of an eye. Once more the prince made the king's attackers run, but this time, while he was fighting, an enemy soldier wounded him in the thigh. Seeing this, the king took out his royal handkerchief and tied it around the boy's leg. He wanted his men to carry the brave warrior straight back to the palace, but the prince grabbed the mane of his faithful horse and managed to pull himself up into the saddle. The next moment, the horse rose into the air and carried him off. The king and his men all cheered. "The glittering knight has saved us again. He must be a god." After the battle, everyone spoke of one thing only. "This hero has won so many battles for us," they said, "but who can he be? He can't be an ordinary man. He must be a god." And the king said, "How I wish I could see him once more. If it turned out that he wasn't a god, but only a man, I'd reward him with half of my kingdom." Well, when the prince got back home, he was exhausted, and he lay down on his bed and fell fast asleep. It was then that his wife noticed the handkerchief tied around his wounded leg, and she wondered what it could be. When she looked at it more closely, she couldn't believe her eyes. There in the corner of the handkerchief, she saw a picture of a royal crown, and underneath it, her father's name. The princess ran straight to the palace and told her father what she had seen. The king and his 2 elder sons-in-law hurried back to the hut with her, and there they saw the young gardener dreaming peacefully on his bed. The scarf that the boy always wore wrapped around his head had slipped off in his sleep, and now his golden hair sparkled on his pillow. At that moment, they all realized that this was the hero who had fought and won so many battles for them. Everyone was overjoyed, and the king rewarded his youngest son-in-law by giving him half of his land. The young prince was now a king himself, and he and his queen were the happiest rulers in the whole world.